Today we are having Mr. Marcus Wimmer. Uh, he is director of world's renowned bank and a climate risk professional. I believe many of us have surely seen his post regarding climate risk and the calculations, the sheets he uploads on his wall. So I have been fan of Mr. Marcus since I think 6 to 7 months. So welcome, Marcus. And I would like to request our board of director member, Mr. Siddharth, to introduce about CRFC, the works we do, our visions and missions. Siddharth.
Yes, thank you again for the introduction, Ashidev. And namaste, Mr. Gurmar. Good morning to you. And we welcome you on to our webinar on behalf of the CRFC uh, family here. So just a brief about our council. Uh, Climate Risk and Finance Council is an NGO that has been established earlier this year in the state of North Carolina, USA. We are actually a group of professionals from various sectors, largely from the banking, investment industries, with special focus on risk management and uh, technology, in the sense of at the intersection of finance and technology. And there are also other professionals from the sustainable industry who are working on. I myself work on the solar industry space, and there are other people who have been working on their waste management and ecoforestry, agroforestry, and things like that. So we hope that with this varied expertise, with varied levels of expertise, we hope to achieve certain targets that we have set for ourselves. One is largely to find how we can deliver climate justice by leveraging the climate finance, primarily by understanding risk. So we hope to a world where we can bring in climate-related financial risk management to its fore and provide new and additional sources of sustainable finance to this towards this transition of this new economy, to this new world that we'll be seeing. And what we aim to do, our mission that we hope to achieve, is to provide some kind of a thought leadership, primarily by first understanding what the lay of the land is about climate risk, provide thought leadership in climate risk and how to manage it, and what would be its impact on the financial institutions and how to finally manage it. Compile and develop resources for climate change and mitigation, largely by working with banks and working with other financial institutions and understanding what is the best case scenario, what is their best practices, so to speak, and eventually to simplify some of these really complex issues for the larger audience to finally implement it in their banks or in their institutions. So that's largely, and one of the reasons that we have this webinars is, and bringing in experts like you, is for the larger for our group and for the larger audience to understand what is climate risk and what is the state of the art in the field in dealing with climate risk. So that's largely about the Climate Risk and Finance Council. Now I would request Mr. Shailendra Singh ji to kindly introduce our honorable speaker, Mr. Marcus Wimmer, for the rest of the audience this
Good
afternoon.
afternoon.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
Siddharth, and good afternoon to everyone. It's indeed my privilege to introduce Mr. Marcus Wimmer, who is joining us from Germany. And he's been responsible for enterprise risk management, risk reporting, and ERM stress testing for continental Europe at leading international bank. In his spare time, Mr. Wimmer has been working intensively on the topic of climate risk for several years, posting regularly on LinkedIn to break down the silos between climate science and banking regulations, and more importantly, to raise awareness of this important topic. We are privileged, sir, to have you with us, and look forward to the next hour and a half for your masterclass. Thanks, and over to you, Mr. Wimmer.
Many thanks for the kind introduction, and good afternoon. I assume most of you are based in India, so I think it's now afternoon. In Germany, it's close to lunchtime, so yeah, let me start. Here I want to present to you the proposed agenda. So firstly, there will be a bit of introduction, then we will talk about climate science. Next chapter will be on climate risk assessments, and then we will briefly touch on energy and emissions at the end, and we'll also look on some interactive tools you can use. So when we talk about climate risk, I always like to present this picture. It's derived from the New York Times. It's now 12 years old, but the proportions have changed. So on the left-hand side, you see stored in this greenish balloon all the water from our planet, and on the right-hand side, it's basically all the air in the atmosphere in this pink balloon. And this is, I think, a very important reminder that whenever we talk about climate risk, it's not just another regulation only for banks, like the ones we have seen before, ICAP, ILAB, fundamental review of the trading book, or interest rate risk in the banking book. These are typical bank-wide and industry-wide regulations which are now in place, but regarding climate risk embedded into ESG, it's a different story. So this is relevant and applicable for all industries, for all regions, for all professions. And yeah, we should not forget that our natural resources are limited. These balloons are the ones which we need to pass on to the next generations, and they will do the same with the following generations. And whenever we have industrial processes, or we travel, we commute, the pollution will end up in either the greenish balloon or the pink balloon or the soil of our planet. And yeah, we should make sure that we don't pollute air, water, and soil too much. And in this context, it's definitely very important to to understand the dynamics and the mechanism of climate risk management. This one is basically, in a nutshell, a summary of the most important climate risk indicators, and we will come to this also on the following slides. This is presented by Ed Hawkins. He's a climate risk professor, and he's very famous for this visualization of the global average temperature, which is increasing, and he's showing this with this color scheme, which goes from this light blue to the dark red, and we are now here in the dark red zone. And this is one of the most prominent visualizations in the climate risk space. And he has also put together this crispy overview of all or some of the most relevant indicators. And I think it's hopefully self-explanatory. We see that the emissions are rising. This is indicated with the greenish, or with the green line. We have ocean warming, also very important. We see sea level rising, and this trend, all these trends will continue in the next decades, and it will make our life more complicated and more challenging. We have global temperature increase. We have troposphere warning. We have the Arctic sea ice. This is decreasing. We have things like cherry blossom, which now starts earlier because of the temperature shifts, and so on. So there are a couple of relevant climate risk indicators, and ideally we don't look only on one, like global average temperature or the atmosphere density of emissions. We should consider all these factors, and this is, I think, a nice dashboard, and I wanted to show it to you. You can forget everything what I say in this presentation. The only idea slash concept I want to share with you is that it's critically important that we break the silos between the different industries. So this one here on the left, or you see here on the left-hand side, some examples of financial regulations. So this here is from the Network for Greening the Financial System. This is basically a club of regulators and supervisors, and round about 90 are in this group of regulators, and they have a very good website where you can find resources which you can use to build up your climate risk governance, to build up your climate risk processes. And there are, of course, other location-specific regulators. This one is the Commodity Future Trading Commission in the US, and they have also published a very interesting report on how to measure and manage climate risks. And here I'm based in Germany, and in Europe, the European Central Bank is, I would say, the front runner regarding climate risk regulation, and they have also proposed this guide on climate risk regulation. This is the bucket on the left-hand side, and I assume it's the same for all locations. All the home regulators have now published their own documents, and when we work in the financial industry, we need to understand these concepts. We need to comply with the current and, of course, also the future regulation. But my key message is that we should not exclude what is published by the climate science community. And here, the IPCC, so Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is, I think, the most prominent group, or the most prominent organization in this context. Whenever they publish one of their IPCC reports, this will also be presented in the newspapers, in the media, and so on. So this is, I think, one of the most prominent organizations, and you should look into these documents. They are extremely helpful to better understand the climate science, and climate science will always be ahead of climate regulation. So whenever the IPCC scientists come up with a warning, like they've done before in the last year when they have published the 3 documents here, this will then be somehow featured within the upcoming regulations, because somehow this knowledge gets transferred into the climate risk regulation. And to be ahead of the curve, it's, I think, very important that we understand, we working in the banks also understand the climate physics. And here the IPCC reports are extremely useful. I will share this link where you can download the presentation at the end of the presentation, and you can press or you can click on the different documents, and you will be redirected to the sources. Besides the IPCC scientists, there are, of course, other well-known institutions like NASA, NOAA, the WMO, but there's also the Chatham House, which is a think tank, and they have published in 2021 a really interesting climate change risk assessment, and I will show you some of the very nice flowcharts in the middle section of this presentation. And so takeaway is there's not only financial regulation, there's also climate science. And to complete the picture, I always recommend to look also into the energy space. And here I would say the International Energy Agency is one of the most prominent and dominant players, and they are publishing really good reports on an ongoing basis. And together, I think when banks and other actors look into the different buckets, they get a much better understanding of where the world is going and how the trends will evolve in the upcoming years and decades. So this is the message I have. Please don't consider only the regulation which is relevant for you. Try to read the management summaries of the most relevant climate science reports, and once in a while you can always check what is going on in the energy space. Then you will get a full picture. All right, so let's jump to the next chapter. This one will be on climate science. And here, this is one of the most relevant visualizations derived from the latest IPCC report. It gives you, again, and I assume most of you have seen similar charts in the past. So just to make sure we are all on the same page, I've incorporated it here in the presentation. You see where the, firstly, you see here how the greenhouse gases have increased since 1990, and what are the different sources and the different gas types which will ultimately end up in the atmosphere. And I don't want to go through the numbers, but I think the trend is clear. It's increasing, which is, of course, good for our economies, but it's bad for our climate, and we will see more and more heat waves and climate hazards in the next years and decades because of the physics of climate science. And yeah, this is just a reminder. Of course, there are different emission pathways, and we are basically in the driver's seat. We as human beings on this planet, we can now make a choice, and we can decide for us and the next generations which temperature pathway and emission pathway we want to log in. So currently, I think the world community is more heading to this upper area where we have rising emissions for the next decades. And this will, of course, drive global warming. And this is here indicated in the bottom area of this visualization. And yeah, I think the message is clear. We need to reduce our emissions, otherwise we will see drastic temperature increase, and this will then translate into extreme climate events. And we are seeing it already. And unfortunately, what we see now will continue, and it will become more severe. So the climate events like floods, storms, wildfires, and so on, heat waves, the intensity will increase, the severity will increase, and also the duration will increase. And this is what the climate scientists are telling us on an ongoing basis now since decades. And I think now we are coming to this point where also politicians and policymakers, governments, they understand that this is an urgent and important topic, and yeah, that we should do or we should manage an energy transition, and we need to reduce our emissions, because otherwise the problems created by global warming will be too extreme. This one here, what you see, let me quickly explain, is basically the world clustered into climate regions. So this is also coming from the IPCC. They have published this visualization in August 2021. And so there are around about 35 climatic regions in the world, according to the climate scientists. And takeaway from this visualization in the upper part is that basically almost everywhere the climate scientists have measured that the temperature is going up. So this is called here hot extremes. So we see it everywhere. Next is because yeah, of climate science, we also have more and more floods and heavy rain events. This is happening in, I would say, 50% of the climate regions, climatic regions. And the third visualization shows you that also droughts are getting more extreme, and this is measured in, I would say, 40% of the climatic regions. And all in all, the takeaway is that our climate is changing because of the emissions we pump up into the atmosphere. And the outcome can be measured almost everywhere, and either it's too hot or it's too hot and we have occasionally too much rain, and then it gets followed by droughts. We have spoken, or I've spoken a bit about rising temperatures, and sometimes when I talk to friends and to other professionals, I get the impression, and they are also telling me that, hey, it doesn't make a big difference whether we have a plus 1.5 degree Celsius temperature increase, or it's +2 or +3, +4. But as you can see here, regarding the percentage numbers, it makes a huge difference. Just when you take one line and you just jump from the left-hand side to the right, you see how the percentages, so the probabilities, are increasing. And I don't want to read everything what is stated here on this visualization, but the message is clear that every fraction of a degree matters. This is a famous sentence in this context. And yeah, it's in our own interest to keep the increase of the global average temperature as low as possible, because yeah, it has severe consequences on almost everything. When we talk about rising temperatures, of course, there is this direct link to climate hazards and extreme weather events, but we should not forget that we as humans, we also suffer from climate risk and rising temperatures. And the World Meteorological Organization, they have published this report in 2021, and I think it's a good reminder that we don't only see climate events and climate hazards and extreme weather events like floods, storms, heat waves, and fires, and so on. We can also, or the scientists and the medics, they can also see the impact global warming has on the human body. And here, without going through all the listed items, so I'm not a medical doctor, so that would be here also too much context or too much info. It's affecting our human health already. So just think of pollution, think of the negative consequences of heat waves, especially for the most vulnerable groups in your countries. So and add this up, and it's also relevant for the health system, for the GDP numbers, for the productivity, and so on. So takeaway is that the consequences of extreme weather events are not only infrastructure losses when floods hit bridges and so on. No, we as human beings, we also suffer from extreme heat and everything else. So good reminder to make sure that we don't forget that this will ultimately also affect our personal health. Here, this is a high-level overview, but when we talk about the future development of our climate and the atmospheres and how future climate hazards will evolve and play out, we should not forget it's super difficult to model this precisely, because there are some so-called climatic tipping points, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with a couple of these climatic tipping points. So there's the Amazonian rainforest, there is the Arctic sea ice, there is the Atlantic circulation, sometimes also called AMOC. There are the big boreal forests, we have coral reefs, we have the Greenland ice shield, we have permafrost in the Siberia region in Russia, which is thawing and also burning, which is really bad because burning permafrost is emitting a lot of methane, and methane is a very potent climate gas, which will intensify global warming. We have the West Antarctic ice shield and the Wilkes Basin. So these are all the climatic tipping points, and unfortunately, because of global warming, we have activated them. And I've given you this example with the permafrost in the Siberia region, which is currently thawing. It's burning, and because the Russian military is currently doing something else, there is also no fire protection in the Siberia region, which shows you also that there's always a link to geopolitics. It's one example, but a very severe one. And yeah, so keep in mind whenever you see forecasts which go from 2022 until 2050 or the year 2100, don't forget that it's very difficult to make precise long-term forecasts because of this very complex to model tipping points. All right, so let's jump into the climate risk assessment part. When we talk about rising temperatures, we should not forget that we need to distinguish between the physical climate risks. So this is these are all the extreme weather events, storms, wildfires, floods, and so on. And with when the temperature goes up, it will trigger more and more of these extreme weather events. In case we come to the conclusion that we don't want to have this future world, and we do whatever it takes to keep our economies and not the economies, the planet below these thresholds. That would mean that we need to have drastic changes regarding the economies. And this will, of course, then trigger transition risks. So policy changes, regulation changes, changes in the economy and the health system and so on. So this is important that we don't forget that we will, without any human action, we will end up with very high temperatures, and this will trigger all the extreme events. But when we now take the proposed steps and change our economies to low emission economies, this will then create many transition risks, and we, working in banks, need to be prepared. And we need to understand the concepts, we need to understand the drivers, the probabilities, and should do whatever it takes to better understand the complexity of climate risk. When you want to develop and implement climate risk frameworks within your institutions, there are plenty of ways to do this. So I've given you already one source, the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a very good go-to portal when you want to learn more about climate risk and how you can implement it into your governance. And so when you want to build up your own expertise and you want to build up your own frameworks, you should consider a couple of different factors. So not only the climate is important, there are also socio-demographic and economic things which should be considered. So things like, how is our world population or the population in your country changing in the next years and decades? So what about technology? What about policies? What about energy usage and land use? So this is all in the greenish bucket. Then of course, it's important to look on the development of the greenhouse gases, air pollutants, and other things here. So like land use change, atmospheric changes. We should check what, of course, what the temperature increase is looking like, and also what about the rain? How are the glaciers? So all the ice areas of this planet, how are they changing? And then there is the agriculture component. And again, this is another factor where climate change and geopolitics come together. I am sure you have also heard about the severe problems now rising in Africa due to the fact that fertilizers and wheat cannot be exported from the Ukraine to Africa. And here, Africa will suffer from the severe climate hazards like droughts, and we have seen this in the last decades. And on top, we have now this shortage of food and shortage of fertilizers, which is super extreme for the African communities. And it's a really big problem for the entire world. And it's another reminder that we should not treat climate risk in isolation. There's always a link to geopolitics, to technology, to human health, and so on. And so this is one way of getting started, to take this visualization as a checklist and try to find credible sources and credible data, and then you can set up and enhance your risk management frameworks over time. This is now one of the famous Chatham House flowcharts. So I'm a great fan of this report, which has been published in 2021, and it gives you a good indication why it's so important to understand climate risk and also to understand climate hazards. So without going through the details, here on the left-hand side, you see in this first list a couple of climate hazards like rainfall pattern changes, droughts, heat waves, storms, wildfires, and floods. So this is nothing new, but what is important is to understand, okay, what comes next? So out of the climate hazards, we can generate things like pests and diseases, water scarcity, crop failure. It's getting too hot to work outside, so this can have a negative impact on the GDP. Think of construction workers and so on. We have a loss of infrastructure, especially when there are floods and thunderstorms. So there's a loss of livelihood and loss and shifts in ecosystems. And this then leads to the next bucket. So that can be social unrest, health crisis, unemployment and poverty, casualties, food crisis, GDP loss, and supply chain and business disruptions. And the next level will then be things like populism, migration waves, what we have also seen in the past. We can have state failure, armed conflicts, market destabilization, reduction of global trade, and protectionism, just to name a few. And this is, I think, one of the best ways to also explain to senior management why it's so important to look into the space of climate risk and to understand what the climate scientists are predicting, because I would say most of these bullet points here are somehow affecting also the business models of banks and the financial stability and the profitability. And therefore, it's important to understand this. So we working in banks, we are really good to understand credit risk management, and we form our opinions on interest rates and so on. But climate risk is, I call it the new kid on the block, and it has a very severe magnitude, and it will shape the way how we will do business in the next years and decades. And it's super important to understand it. Here in this Chatham House presentation, there are a couple of more granular flowcharts. I just want to give you here one or two examples because this is extremely interesting to read and to think through the different bullet points, and also how the errors are set up and how they are amplifying each other from time to time. So this one is on the economic and trade disruptions. And there's another, this is the only example I have here in this slide deck, but when you click on the link, and as I've said, you will get the link to download this presentation at the end, you can see, I think, 8 or 9 other flowcharts on energy security, on health-related issues, on many things which are really interesting. And this is, of course, always good to use for brainstorming sessions, for checking if your governance is adequately set up, if you have sufficient resources, if you have the relevant data. And so these flowcharts are extremely helpful to make your to enhance your climate risk frameworks. This one is one of the most prominent visualizations coming from the Network for Greening the Financial System. So when you work in a bank or an insurance company, you are familiar with all the risk types on the left, on the right-hand side. So credit, market risk, underwriting risk for insurance companies, OR, and liquidity risk. And we have I've spoken about climate risks and the importance to distinguish between transition risks and physical risks. And there are these so-called economic transmission channels. And when you set up your governance, you should look how the economic transmission channels work, and you can distinguish between the micro level and the macro level. And you can also distinguish within the micro level between the businesses and the individual households. So how are climate risk events changing the behavior of businesses and households? And this can, of course, when you want to have the aggregated macro view, you can, of course, look also on the bigger picture and take one country and see how climate risks are shaping the way business is done and how regulation is rolled out and so on. So how climate risk is affecting the labor market, the health systems, and so on. So this is the way the mechanics work. So we have climate risks on the left-hand side, and they get translated via the economic transmission channels into the financial risks, which are plotted here on the right-hand side. And yeah, so there are, of course, feedback loops. Yeah, it's a good way of thinking through the consequences of climate risk. Here, this is just one additional slide from the United Nations on climate hazards, just in case you want to get more information on how you can split climate risks into smaller pieces and how you can generate risk drivers which you can use to make your climate risk frameworks better and more effective. So things you can use for discussions and for senior management meetings and so on. When you want to have regional specific information from the climate science community, I can strongly recommend to check these links. Everything what you see here is linked. So when you are interested in the physical science and what the IPCC scientists have created for, let's say, Asia, and I assume most of you are interested in this region, so you can click on, I won't do this now to make sure that nothing happens during the presentation, but everything is linked and you can get very crispy, I think, 2-page summaries on the current state of the climate and also the impacts, adaptation and vulnerabilities for the different regions, and it gives you a more granular picture on the regions you are interested in, and this is of course helpful for all discussions or for all risk assessments. All right, so let me just jump on the next chapter. This one is on energy and emissions, and this is unfortunately a bit blurry, this visualization, but for this purpose, I haven't found any better quality picture. So what you see here are a couple of dots, and the dots represent power plants. So thermal power plants, nuclear power plants, refineries, and also copper mines, so raw materials. And the shape of the color coding here in the region, they give you an indication on how severe the water stress is. So we see a lot of water stress here in Africa and the Middle East, and also in Asia, same for North America, and yeah, the rest. So whenever you see this amber color, then I would say it's fine, but when you see the red color, it's really bad. And unfortunately, there's also a direct link between energy creation and generation and the access to water. So almost all power plants need water. Take nuclear power plants, they need water for cooling. It's the same for all other power plants. So fossil fuel-based power plants, I have to say. And that means whenever there is water stress, this is also it's increasing the likelihood of blackouts, because when there is no water and the rivers are gone because there's a multi-week heat wave or multi-month heat wave, this can cause severe disruptions in the supply chains because of blackouts. And the world electricity demand is growing and growing from year to year. We have now the electrification of almost everything. Just take electric vehicles or all sorts of industries. Everyone is trying to get electric. That means the demand is rising. The supply is also rising a bit, but the likelihood of having blackouts is unfortunately also rising. And this should be considered in all risk assessments. And therefore, I've incorporated this slide here in this presentation as well. This is a high-level overview from the International Energy Agency. It shows you where we are today, indicated with the size of the different arrows. And we have a lot of fossil fuel, we have a bit of renewables, and we have, of course, different main industry groups. And in the next 30 years, we need to fully transform our economies. We need to get to much higher level of renewables, and we need to reduce the usage of fossil fuels to a minimum. We won't get rid of them. They are needed for some industries and for some specific production processes and so on. But this error size indicates how we need to change our economies. And I think even if this is super high level, it gives us a good indication how drastic the changes will be in the next decades for all regions, for almost all industries. Yeah, because we need to get to a point where we are more sustainable and we run our economies more with green energy and not with with fossil fuels. When we talk about renewables, you just keep in mind, and I will explain how this map can be used. So there is, of course, always the two most prominent ones are solar and wind, but not all regions are have good climatic characteristics for the different renewable energy types. So take the solar, which is plotted here on the left side in this map. So solar works super well in Africa because of the sun hours per month, and it works super good in Australia, and of course here in also some other regions, but it works not so good in the northern part of our hemisphere. And it's a different story for wind energy. So of course, wind always works good at the coast, and this is indicated here with the color coding. And I hope it's self-explanatory. You see that from a bank point of view, it wouldn't make much sense to give a loan to a company which wants to set up solar panels in Siberia. That is maybe not the best use case, but it can be a really good opportunity to set up solar parks in Africa, because here the climatic the climatic characteristics are extremely good in comparison to other regions, and same for a similar approach for wind energy. This is another way of visualizing where we stand today. And when you think of fossil fuels, it can be broken down into liquids, gases, and solids. Solids is coal. And this is the share of renewable energy right now, indicated with green. And when you compare it, you see that it's very, very small. Even if we see a lot of headlines in the news about new parks to be set up, and new electricity coming, or more electricity coming from renewables, which is good. But when you compare to the actual size of the markets, it's quite tiny. And it's the same for liquids, gases, and also solids. And the International Energy Agency, they have also created some scenarios. And in all scenarios, the portion of renewables will increase. But you see also here, when you go to the last part of this visualization, in comparison, it's getting more. So from 2 green dots, or 2 green areas to 6. So there's an increase of 200%, so to say. But in comparison, you see that the relative change is not that big. So it's still a lot of liquids coming from fossil fuels in 10 years' time. And it's something similar for the other fossil fuel sources. So this is what we should keep in mind. Yeah, it's one way of describing the relationship between the different energy sources over time. When we talk about emissions, and it's of course important to not only look on energy, but also on the emissions, we should not forget that it makes sense to look on the historic developments, but it's not about blaming regions for their output. It's more about giving the different regions some guidance how they can create these green economies. So this is a picture from the website Our World in Data, and it shows you the development of emissions coming from different regions and how it has evolved over time, and who's now the biggest contributor to the global emission levels. And yeah, it's I think a very good reminder where we are, where we come from, how the different regions have developed over time, and what can be done to reduce the levels. And there are more, there's more data available, so it's definitely very interesting to check the Our World in Data portal to see more about emissions and also energy and other important components. All right, so yeah, this is basically the end of my presentation. In case you're interested, I've set up a portal where professionals can download interesting office toolkits. This is very helpful for practitioners. It's full of links and sources, and you can, this is basically the big presentation, the full picture, and I've derived all my slides from the presentation, which has now more than 150 slides. It can be downloaded for free. Here's the link. I can also share it via the chat, and you are all invited to visit me on my LinkedIn profile. I'm happy to answer the questions in case you have also questions in the next days. And yeah, it was a pleasure to give this presentation today, and now we can, I'm happy to take your questions. So many thanks.
So thank you so much, Marcus. And if you have any question, you can unmute yourself, and or if you are having some network issue, you can post in the chat box also.
Hi, Marcus. Very good afternoon. This is Kumar. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, basically, I have two questions. Climate, we all know that it has been self-evaluating for over few generations. So how do you see this climate changes, whatever we are discussing, will become a new normal so that the other climatic conditions will try to negate whatever challenges we have, maybe over a period of time? That is one thing. Second question, banks being such an important stakeholder in this entire climate risk calculations. So, and if you see all the banking regulations, these are all framed towards maintaining the sustainability of the bank. So probably this the environment guidelines is something which is more proactive on the banking side. So how do you see this, ESG related guidance or ESG related guidelines to the banks to motivate them to be more proactive? Because of all the regulations, if you see in the banking space, they are all in a way trying to protect banking from doing certain things which will, put a question mark on their existence. So, but this set of guidelines is something new. So how do you see banks, or what motivation factors or what incentives you can think of to make banks comply to this ESG more on a proactive basis?
Yeah, so very good question. So I have to say, firstly, there are, of course, many different things which should be considered. So let me start with, there's currently no level playing field. When you look on the different regulatory regimes across the planet, we have different pace right now regarding climate risk regulation. And yeah, it's super challenging for globally operating banks, which are engaged in all regions, to design and implement efficient, robust climate risk frameworks. So the regulation will evolve over time. So next year, the regulation will look different to what we see right now. There will be new regulation, new requirements. There are some big challenges like data. I think also the network for greening the financial system, they've pointed this out. Currently, it's not that easy to find good climate risk data from clients. This is a gap which needs to be filled in the next months, years, and also decades. And yeah, it's now, I think we have seen this in the last months. There were a couple of greenwashing cases in different countries. And this is, of course, alarming also the regulators. And I would assume that the climate risk regulation will become stricter, and the regulators will demand more resources to be invested into setting up climate risk governance functions. And when you compare the insurance companies with the traditional banks, we have now a lot of climate scientists who work in insurance companies, because there it's part of their business model. When you want to get a insurance coverage for a certain building, you need to have your climate risk assessments, and you need to see whether there's a high flood risk and so on. So the point I want to make is that insurance companies are currently ahead of the curve because they have the in-house expertise, and they have hired climate scientists in the last decades, and they have their dedicated teams and functions. And they are also, for them, it's much easier to understand the climate science reports which get published by the IPCC and other well-known institutions. And I think banks, they have an own interest to also be ahead of the curve. And when you think of what or how banks have hired experts on cryptocurrencies or artificial intelligence in the last years, I think the next good step in the right direction would be hiring real climate scientists who are then also able to set up efficient climate risk management frameworks and to support the existing functions. So there are plenty of professionals who have a really good understanding of how to measure and manage climate risk or market risk, operational risk, liquidity risk. And now we in the banks, we need to build up the in-house expertise also regarding climate science and not only climate regulation. And this is the message I've given to you in the beginning. So it's not only climate regulation. This is of course important and super important for all banks. But to make sure that we understand the big picture, we should also understand what the climate scientists are telling us, because they are ahead of the curve. And we should not exclude the energy space. So ideally, we blend all this together, or we mix it together. And this should enable banks to build up very robust climate risk and ESG functions. And this is my personal view. I know it's all banks have their own approach, and this is fine. But I would recommend to look more into the climate science space and also hire real climate scientists, because yeah, they will be really beneficial for the risk functions and also for the business functions, because ultimately the bank's clients are facing the same problems. They need to be prepared for supply chain disruptions. They need to be prepared for macro changes, like interest rate environment is changing, FX rates are changing, commodity prices are changing, and we are seeing this right now. Currently, it's more triggered by geopolitics, but in the future, also climate hazards and extreme weather events will shape our macroeconomies and the price levels. And here, I think it is always better to be prepared in advance. And therefore, yeah, this is my view. It's good to listen to the climate science community and build up in-house expertise.
Thank you, Marcus. One question from Hemlata Mohan. She has posted in the chat box that now that Europe is going back to coal, will that not worsen the situation we already are in?
Yeah, sure. So from a climate science point of view, it's definitely not a good decision because of the additional emissions which will be pumped into the atmosphere. But I think we all know where this is coming from. So because of the Russian invasion into the Ukraine, we have now the special situation regarding our energy supply, and we need to make sure all the economies in Europe and also Germany, we want to make sure that we don't get into very extreme economic crisis because we don't have sufficient energy, and all industries would suffer from such a situation. So I think this is now we are trying to build a bridge between the current geopolitical situation and the future energy supply, which is ideally based on renewables, but due to the ongoing war and the situation regarding Russia and the Ukraine, I think Europe is now building this interim bridge. So it's a workaround basically, but ideally we use the time and the resources and also the money in the most efficient way, and we build up green economies in the next years. But you are right. So every coal power plant which gets added to the grid will lead to more emissions, and this will, of course, lead to more extreme climate events.
Okay, thank you so much, Marcus. Any more questions from audience?
Hi, Marcus. This is Amit here. Thanks
Hello.
for the wonderful session. I have a question on carbon prices. Carbon prices are treated as one of the levers to mitigate climate risk or get climate risk in control. Most central banks are using NGFS as scenarios in terms of assessing which scenario we would go as a country and how do they mitigate the risk to the bank. So do you have any sense on how are carbon prices actually taken as input in the NGFS? Because it seems that the prices seems to be very high as compared to what carbon prices would be applicable for that country. So is there dissonance in the carbon price that the models are assuming?
Yeah, sure. So that's definitely a very interesting topic. I have to say I'm not an expert on carbon price mechanisms, but it's definitely worth for all banks to look into the into this field and to understand the implications of a carbon price rise across the time horizon. So it should be one of the key components in all climate risk assessments and all climate risk frameworks. And you need to consider this also, I think, in scenario analysis and stress testing. So it should be one component because it will ultimately have an impact on the productivity, on the profitability of your clients when there are rising carbon prices, and all your clients or your industries need to consider this. This will lower the profitability. Therefore, it's getting also important for banks. But it's of course not the only component which should be considered. There are the commodity prices, which are, I think, equally important. There are the physical climate risks, which could lead to supply chain disruptions. And I think we have seen with the corona pandemic and the fact that some harbors in China were closed due to the corona situation, and we have seen the implications all over the world that we have had and we still have disruptions regarding our supply chain. So it's a very complex topic. I think it's almost impossible to make precise predictions how this will evolve in the next 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, because of the fact that this is, I think, also important, that climate risk is already in itself super complex and challenging, but there are plenty of other factors which also need to be considered. And geopolitics is a really good example. And the previous question was on coal power plants. Of course, Europe had a different plan in its pocket until the 24th of February when the war has started. And now we need to find a good solution here. And I think regarding carbon price mechanisms and how this can be considered in climate risk assessments. It's also very important that banks build up, and all financial institutions, including the regulators, they build up in-house expertise, and they also share their knowledge in a good way with their relevant stakeholders. And for banks, I think it's important to also guide the clients regarding the carbon price mechanism, how it works, how it could affect their businesses. It should play a role in almost for almost all products which are requested by business clients. So yeah, it's an important topic, and yeah, very interesting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have one more question, and I believe this would be the last question for this session. From Abhyuday, he asked, how does one quantify climate risk given ESG ratings are not standardized and clear taxonomies are yet to be agreed on globally? What metrics can banks develop to adjust their risk metrics?
Good point. So I think I've said this in the beginning, and I will share the link to this presentation. So ideally, so there's nothing. Or let me phrase it this way. I think waiting until you have a clear and full picture is probably not the best approach, because climate risk management, including ESG, sustainability management, and everything is now evolving very dynamically and very quickly. And I think in the next quarters, years, decades, we will have plenty of new regulation, because the regulators are now paying a lot of attention on this topic, and they also demand a lot of actions from the banks. And you will see this in future audits. And so I think getting started is the most important first step, and then trying to get better every single day. And you can use plenty of free resources like this NGFS, Network for Greening the Financial System. This is basically, as I've said, it's a club of regulators, and they give guidance to banks and central banks regarding climate risk management and what banks should do. So it's a very good source, and I strongly recommend, if you haven't checked the NGFS portal before, I recommend to do so, because there are plenty of really good publications available for download. Everything is free. The portal works quite nicely. It's really good. And when you then add additional information from the climate science community, and this was my message in the beginning, so please don't look only on the climate regulation space. Try to mix it together with information, with the latest information from the climate science community. And then ideally, if you have time and resources, look what the energy world is doing, what they are planning, what kind of scenarios they have, what kind of metrics they use. And then I think you get a good picture where the world is heading, and where the different industries across regions are heading. And this should enable you to make better decisions, because in the end, everything what we do in our banks and also in other financial institutions is making good decisions or preparing for decision making. So when you talk about credit risk management, market risk management, OR, liquidity risk, it's always about decision making. And we should not forget that regarding climate risk management, it's also about how we can enable our senior management to make better decisions. That can mean things like having thresholds for industries, or more growth in certain areas, degrowth in others, sell-off of portfolios, and so on. So it's our job to set up efficient frameworks which are ready to be used, which are fit for purpose. And I cannot say which set of metrics should be incorporated in your risk assessment frameworks, but every financial institution has its own business model, its own characteristics, its own setup and governance, and so on. And now it's basically our job to add this new kid on the block, climate risk management, as a building block into this existing framework, and to make sure that yeah, the framework works quite nicely and enables the decision makers to make the best decisions they can make. And there we see this now with regarding, let's take the Russian war as an extreme example, but we can see that within one day the global outlook can change, and we have seen this with the pandemic before. So there are these unknown uncertainties, and they, when they are activated and when it happens, we need to come up with new forecasts, because these are game changers. And I think the pandemic and the war in the Ukraine are good examples that you can have the best forecast in January, but when there is a new geopolitical event which has this magnitude and this countermeasures and consequences, then of course banks and all financial institutions and regulators need to update their forecasts and their plans. So we are living in a very dynamic world, and climate risk is happening. We have geopolitics, we have domestic politics, we have many other factors which need to be considered. So climate risk is just one pillar in this overall risk assessment.
I think Siddharth is having one last question. Siddharth?
No, I'm
Sure.
just wondering, because there are some more questions as well. Perhaps if it's okay to email you some of these questions
Yes.
later on.
Yes, sure. We will be forwarding those questions, and
if Mr. Wimmer is comfortable to answer them at a later point.
Yeah, I would recommend to use LinkedIn. So this is my go-to platform. So feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to help you also in the next days.
Certainly, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we are also joined by our chairman of the board of directors, Mr. Srinivas Rela. So I would request Rela sir to just say a few words about the session and all.
Okay. Thanks, Kashyap. Marcus, I think this is definitely a wonderful session. I could not actually join, I think, from the beginning because of my some personal commitment. But I started, I think, midway. But it is so insightful. I'm really, really excited. I think the content, what you are presenting, the way, the relevance. I think you are actually, this climate risk is a multi-dimensional problem, right? It is not only from the finance point of view, but also from the data, climate risk, multiple guidelines. It is a multidiscipline, and the way you actually presented the concepts are wonderful. I'm sure, I think every participant got enriched. I think they got, I think, more the value than the time they have spent in attending your session.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the session. And I want to have a maybe one-on-one discussion with you at your convenient time, so that I think I want to actually, because we are looking for, I think, more and more guidance from you. So you are aware about this CRFC, right? A brief, because we are a network of practitioners from different domains, right? From even we have agriculture scientists, because we want to understand that perspective. We have participation from the data people, technology people, bank people. So multiple domains, I think we actually we pull together and form this non-profit association with the main objective of sensitizing the stakeholders, and also to provide a platform wherein we can actually, because I think my basic idea is, for example, I'm an expert in Basel guidelines, the credit risk, market risk, and operational risk. The Basel guidelines are in the public domain since last 3 decades, but still people are struggling to understand and implement. If that is the case, what would be the fate of the climate risk, which is, I think, much more dynamic, much more complex, right? So that is the reason I believe sensitizing all the stakeholders is very, very important to some platform. So that is the main intention of, I think, floating this organization. Thank you very much. I want to have maybe a separate one-on-one call, so that
sure, we can have this, of course.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. And I have seen, I think, a lot of new participants in this webinar session. I definitely sincerely appeal all of you. If you want to actually associate and learn more and more about the CRFC and climate risk, I appeal you to take the membership, or even I think you can volunteer and you can share your knowledge on your own domains related to climate risk and finance. So it is, I think, this is how I think we can actually get enriched with this subject, complex subject. So that is what I think want to share. Thanks, Kashyap.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah, cool. Many thanks. So I can only say many thanks also to you for firstly the invitation and for the opportunity to speak today on a Sunday. And yeah, it was a real pleasure. And as I've said, you can get this presentation with more than 150 slides for free. I've passed this, or I've put the link into the chat, and you're all invited to also download the other toolkits and to visit me on my LinkedIn profile, where you can, of course, reach out with more specific questions. So let me try to help you in the next days. And yeah, I'm wishing you a great session today. And again, many thanks for the invitation. That was really a good opportunity for me to share my insights on climate risk. And also many thanks for the really good questions. So I have to say, it's not always the case that the questions are so specific and so good. So yeah, I can only say thank you from my end, and I'm wishing you a nice Sunday.
Okay, so we have RK Anand sir, our another director. He will be giving vote of thanks to Marcus and all the participants, all the all whoever joined from across the world. So RK Anand sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Kashyap. Am I audible?
Yes, perfectly audible.
Yeah.
Fine. Thank you very much, Kashyap, for giving me this opportunity to be there at the end, and personally and on behalf of the CRFC and on behalf of the participants to whom we are so thankful in joining us today in learning this subject from an expert, Marcus Wimmer. Wimmer, we started with you in the beginning. It was very difficult today, truly speaking, as if we are talking to an international risk management banker or a scientist from the climate risk area. So we learned today from you that day by day, daily, we have to learn to develop this subject. So your insightful first portion of your presentation into the understanding of the physical part of the climate risk with so much rich data and authentic reports on that is a pathfinder for us. Second learning we all had from you today that insurance, which is a sister concern for the financial institutions in BFSI, is way ahead of banks in understanding climate risk. So if they are at a point to quantify and work out their premium rates for the climate risk hedging or the insurance, I think this is one good area for the banks to have this knowledge sharing from them. And your work on integrating the silos of the work done by the climate scientists, then the financial regulators, and the your energy sector, it's on a different silo. So integration of all this, humbly we in our council, which is a very humble beginning under our chairman initiative and the very enthusiastic colleagues with us, is heading towards this approach, and your encouragement of saying that day by day learning will help us in refining this subject. And as already requested by our chairman, we would like that your association be continued with us in understanding the subject and helping us in evolving certain practical methodologies, ways for the risk management practitioners in the banking sector or the other financial institutions to come down in the effective risk management as they have done for other financial risks. So very well enriching session indeed, Marcus Wimmer. Thanks a lot from all of us, from the CRFC and the participants. Thank you very much.
All right. So many thanks again from my end. It was a pleasure, and you're all invited reach out via LinkedIn, and I hope you enjoy also the presentation, which you can download, and you can use it for your purposes and for your needs. It can be customized. It's without any protection. It comes as a PDF and a PowerPoint. So whenever you want to give trainings within your institutions, you can do it with these up-to-date slides. And currently 150 slides are available and fully free. And I hope you enjoy it and benefit from this, I call it toolkit. And yeah, again, it was a pleasure. And I'm now hopping off, and I'm wishing you a nice day and nice evening in India, and looking forward to continuing this discussion via LinkedIn. And yeah, so have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.